The morning mist hung thick over the moorland as September's chill crept through the Highland glens. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 21st, 1745, approximately 2,500 Jacobite Highlanders, later reinforced to around 4,000, prepared to face a professional British government army nearly 5 times their size. What transpired in the next 15 minutes would become one of the most devastating military defeats in British history, a clash so swift and brutal that it would be remembered for centuries as the Battle of Prestonpans. This wasn't merely a battle between Scotland and England, though national sentiment certainly inflamed passions on both sides. Rather, it was a pivotal engagement in the Jacobite Rising of 1745, a desperate attempt to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne. The combatants were Highlanders loyal to Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, facing government forces under Sir John Cope. What made this battle extraordinary wasn't just the lopsided victory, but the sheer ferocity and tactical brilliance with which the outnumbered Scots destroyed a larger, better-equipped army in less time than it takes to brew a pot of tea. The road to Prestonpans. To understand the magnitude of what occurred on that September morning, we must first comprehend the desperation and determination that brought these forces to this field east of Edinburgh. Charles Edward Stuart had landed in Scotland just 2 months earlier, on July 23, 1745, with only 7 companions, the famous 7 Men of Moidart. His father, James Francis Edward Stuart, was the son of the deposed King James II of England and 7th of Scotland, who had been forced from his throne during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Jacobite cause had seemed moribund, a relic of failed rebellions past, most notably the Rising of 1715 and the abortive 1719 attempt. But Charles possessed something his father lacked: charisma, youth, and an infectious optimism that bordered on recklessness. When he raised his father's standard at Glenfinnan on August 19, 1745, he attracted the support of several Highland clans whose loyalty to the Stuart cause remained fierce despite decades of disappointment. The prince's army grew rapidly as he marched south. Clan Cameron, Clan MacDonald, Clan Stuart of Appin, and others rallied to his banner. These weren't professional soldiers in the conventional sense. They were clansmen bound by ancient ties of kinship and feudal obligation, warriors from a martial culture that had survived in Scotland's mountains while the rest of Britain modernized. They carried broadswords, dirks, and Lochaber axes alongside muskets and pistols, and they practiced a style of warfare that seemed archaic to professional military men, yet it would prove devastatingly effective. By early September, the Jacobite army had captured Edinburgh without firing a shot, though the castle garrison held out. This remarkable bloodless victory sent shockwaves through Britain. The government in London had been caught completely unprepared. King George II had sent many of his best troops to fight in the War of Austrian Succession on the continent, leaving Britain defended by second-line forces and raw recruits. The man charged with stopping this Highland horde was Lieutenant General Sir John Cope, an experienced officer who had served in the War of Spanish Succession under the Duke of Marlborough. Cope had initially marched north to intercept the Jacobites in the Highlands, but had been outmaneuvered by Charles's advisors, particularly the brilliant Lord George Murray, who had convinced Cope to march toward Inverness, while the Jacobite army slipped south toward Edinburgh. By the time Cope realized he'd been duped, the capital was in enemy hands. Cope had no choice but to transport his army by sea from Aberdeen to Dunbar, landing on September 17th. His force comprised approximately 2,200 regular infantry, 600 cavalry, and around 1,000 recently recruited volunteers and militia, about 3,800 men in total, though contemporary accounts vary. They were equipped with the finest weapons of the age: Brown Bess muskets, artillery pieces, and bayonets that had made British infantry feared across Europe. Cope's dragoons wore scarlet coats and polished brass, the very picture of military professionalism. Against this formidable force stood Charles's Highland army, which had grown to approximately 2,500 men. Some accounts suggest as few as 2,000 initially present, with reinforcements bringing the total to perhaps 4,000 during and after the battle. They were a wild-looking bunch by contemporary standards. Many wore Highland dress, kilts, plaids, and bonnets, though others dressed in the more conventional clothing of tenant farmers and townsmen. Their weaponry was eclectic. Some carried fine French muskets, others ancient matchlocks or fowling pieces, and many relied primarily on their traditional edged weapons. What the Highlanders lacked in uniformity and modern equipment, they possessed in motivation and fighting spirit. These men were defending a way of life, following chiefs they revered, and fighting for a prince who had won their hearts. They also possessed something British commanders consistently underestimated: tactical flexibility born from centuries of clan warfare in difficult terrain. The armies converge. On September 20th, the two armies maneuvered for position near the village of Prestonpans, about 9 miles east of Edinburgh. The field of battle was bounded by the Firth of Forth to the north and a treacherous bog to the south. Cope, recognizing his numerical advantage in regular troops and particularly in cavalry and artillery, chose his ground carefully. He positioned his army on open, level ground perfectly suited to conventional European warfare, the kind of battlefield where disciplined infantry in line formation could deliver devastating musket volleys, where cavalry could charge effectively, and where his artillery could rake approaching enemies with grapeshot. The position seemed ideal. The bog protected his southern flank, making it nearly impossible for the Highlanders to attack from that direction. His front and flanks were open, giving his cavalry room to maneuver and his artillery clear fields of fire. Cope deployed his infantry in a single line, cavalry on the wings, and artillery pieces positioned to maximize their effect. By any conventional military assessment, he had chosen excellently. Charles and his commanders surveyed Cope's position with frustration. A frontal assault across open ground against entrenched artillery and disciplined musket fire would be suicidal, negating all the advantages of the Highland charge. The prince, eager for battle, initially favored an immediate attack despite the odds. His war council, particularly Lord George Murray and the Duke of Perth, counseled patience. They needed either to wait for Cope to make a mistake or find an unexpected avenue of attack. As the sun set on September 20th, both armies bivouacked within sight of each other. The Highlanders lit their campfires and played their pipes, the haunting sound of war music drifting across the darkening field. Cope's men, many of them raw recruits who had never faced battle, listened to those eerie melodies and contemplated the morning. Stories of Highland savagery had been circulating for years in English broadsheets and tavern tales. The propaganda depicted Jacobite Highlanders as bloodthirsty barbarians who gave no quarter, who wielded their claymores with supernatural ferocity. For young soldiers far from home, facing such an enemy in their first battle, the night must have seemed endless. In the Jacobite camp, fortune smiled on the rebels in the form of a local man named Robert Anderson. This resident of the area approached the Highland commanders with crucial intelligence. He knew a path through the supposedly impassable bog. It was narrow and treacherous, passable only by men on foot moving in single file. But it existed. If the Jacobites could move their army through this path during the night, they could attack Cope's position from the east, from his vulnerable rear or flank, just as dawn broke. This intelligence transformed the tactical situation entirely. Lord George Murray immediately grasped its significance. A night march was always risky. armies could become scattered and disoriented in darkness, losing all cohesion before battle was even joined. But the potential reward was enormous. If they could navigate the marsh successfully and deploy undetected, they could engage Cope's army before it could properly form to meet them, negating the advantages of his artillery and possibly his cavalry as well. Charles approved the plan. Orders went out to the clan chiefs. The army would move at night, in complete silence, following Anderson through the marsh. No fires were to be lit, no pipes played, no talking above a whisper. Every man was to maintain contact with the man in front of him. The approach would be made in column, but once clear of the bog, they would rapidly deploy into battle formation, 3 lines deep in the Highland fashion, with clan regiments maintaining their distinct identities. The Night March. Around 4 a.m. on September 21st, the Jacobite army began its movement. The night was dark, with only starlight to guide them, which was perhaps fortunate as it concealed their movement from Cope's sentries. In single file, approximately 2,500 Highlanders, some sources suggest more arrived later, snaked through the treacherous marsh, following Robert Anderson's lead. It was slow, nerve-wracking work. Men stumbled in the darkness, sinking ankle-deep or deeper into the muck. The slightest noise might alert government sentries. One accidental musket discharge, one shouted curse, could ruin everything. The discipline shown by the Highland Army during this night march deserves recognition. These were not professional soldiers drilled for years in coordinated maneuvers. They were Clansmen whose military organization derived from social structures, yet they executed this complex night movement with remarkable success. Clan chiefs and their captains maintained control, ensuring their men kept moving and stayed together. The march took hours. The bog was perhaps a mile across at the point where Anderson led them, but navigating it in darkness with thousands of men stretched the process out considerably. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the last Highlanders cleared the marsh. They had done it. They were now positioned either directly east or slightly northeast of Cope's army. Accounts vary on the precise geography, with the government forces still in their overnight positions, unprepared for attack from this direction. Lord George Murray immediately began deploying the army. Clan regiments formed into 3 lines, a formation that would allow them to deliver several waves of attack. The front line comprised some of the most fearsome fighting clans: the MacDonalds, Camerons, Stuarts of Appin, and others. Each clan jealously guarded its position in the line. The place of honor on the right wing traditionally belonged to Clan MacDonald, though there was apparently some dispute before this battle that required Charles himself to intervene and grant the MacDonalds their customary position. The second and third lines formed up behind them. This wasn't the rigid, linear formation of European armies, but something more organic, with clan units maintaining their internal cohesion while contributing to the overall battle line. The Highlanders checked their weapons one final time. Those with muskets primed their powder pans. Those relying primarily on swords, and there were many, loosened their blades in their scabbards. Some removed much of their clothing, stripping down to their shirts, or even less, believing that freedom of movement was more important than protection in the kind of close-quarters melee they anticipated. As dawn broke, approximately 5:30 a.m., government sentries finally spotted the Jacobite army. Alarm spread through Cope's camp with terrifying speed. The entire army had to wheel about 90 degrees to face this unexpected threat. Infantry regiments scrambled to reform their lines, officers shouting orders, drummers beating the call to arms. Cavalry struggled to mount and organize. Artillery crews rushed to reposition their guns. Cope, to his credit, responded as quickly as the situation allowed. Despite the chaos, he managed to get his army into some semblance of fighting formation. His infantry formed their line, bayonets fixed. His dragoon regiments, Hamiltons and Gardiners, took position on the wings. His artillery pieces were hastily repositioned to face the approaching Highlanders. But everything was rushed, improvised, and the soldiers knew they were facing the enemy from an unexpected direction, which inevitably affected morale. The Highland Charge. The sun had just broken the horizon when the Jacobite army began its advance. This was the moment that would define the battle, that would send shockwaves through the British establishment and inspire terror and admiration in equal measure. The Highland Charge. This tactic was unique to the clans and had evolved over centuries of warfare in the Scottish mountains. It was both terrifyingly simple and devastatingly effective against enemies unprepared for its ferocity. The Highlanders would advance rapidly toward the enemy line, often at a running pace. Those armed with muskets would fire a single volley at close range, perhaps 20 or 30 yards, then immediately discard their firearms. They would draw their swords and pistols and crash into the enemy line at full speed, relying on shock and momentum to break through the formation. This tactic exploited a fundamental weakness in the linear warfare of the period. European armies fought in rigid lines, 3 or 4 ranks deep, delivering controlled musket volleys in sequence. Discipline was everything. Soldiers were trained to stand firm, reload mechanically, and fire on command even as enemies approached. This system was highly effective against other armies using similar tactics, but it was psychologically demanding. It required men to suppress every natural instinct for self-preservation and maintain formation while being shot at. The Highland Charge attacked this system at its most vulnerable point, the psychological breaking point of individual soldiers. Instead of the measured exchange of volleys at medium range, Highlanders closed the distance as quickly as possible, minimizing the time they were exposed to enemy fire and maximizing the psychological impact of their assault. A line of screaming, half-naked warriors sprinting toward you with drawn swords is a terrifying sight. For inexperienced soldiers, it was often too much. At Prestonpans, the Highland Charge was executed with devastating effect. As the clans advanced, Cope's artillery opened fire. Contemporary accounts describe the guns firing multiple rounds, but the effect was limited. In the rush of redeployment, the artillery may not have been optimally positioned, and the rapidly moving Highlanders were difficult targets. Some cannonballs plowed through the advancing ranks, killing and wounding men, but not enough to slow the charge. Cope's infantry fired their volleys. The Brown Bess musket was effective at close range, and the government infantry were trained to deliver coordinated fire. But several factors worked against them. First, many were inexperienced recruits who had never faced battle before. Second, the speed of the Highland advance limited the number of volleys they could deliver. Perhaps 2 at most before the Highlanders were upon them. Third, and perhaps most critically, their morale was already shaken by the surprise of finding the enemy where they shouldn't be. The Highland front line crashed into Cope's left wing like a hammer blow. The impact was both physical and psychological. Highlanders wielded their broadswords with savage skill, cutting down men who had only their bayonets for close-quarters defense. The broadsword, or claymore, was a formidable weapon in skilled hands, a single-edged blade designed for powerful slashing cuts that could cleave through limbs and skulls. Combined with the targe, a small round shield, carried by many Highlanders, it made them deadly in hand-to-hand combat. The government left wing broke almost immediately. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled. This collapse exposed the flank of the units to their right, creating a cascading failure along the line. Within minutes, Cope's carefully arranged infantry formation had dissolved into chaos. Cope's cavalry, which should have been his decisive advantage, proved worse than useless. Both Hamilton's and Gardiner's dragoon regiments were positioned to charge into the Highland ranks and break up their formation. Cavalry charges against infantry were devastating in European warfare. Few infantry formations could withstand the psychological and physical impact of hundreds of horses thundering toward them. But the dragoons had to charge across broken ground while under fire from Highland muskets and pistols, and many of the horses panicked. Colonel James Gardiner, commanding his dragoon regiment, attempted to rally his men and lead a charge into the Highland ranks. It was an act of considerable bravery, particularly given that he was in his late 50s and suffering from poor health. But his men wouldn't follow. The dragoons broke and fled, sweeping away their own infantry in their panic. Gardiner, refusing to retreat, fought on foot until he was cut down by Highland swords. He died of his wounds shortly after the battle, one of the few government officers to emerge from Preston pans with his honor intact. Hamilton's dragoons on the opposite wing fared no better. They too broke and fled without delivering any meaningful charge. The rout was becoming general. Government soldiers were throwing down their weapons and running for their lives. Some tried to surrender, but in the heat of battle, with blood rage upon them, many Highlanders gave little quarter. The battlefield became a scene of slaughter. 15 minutes of fury. The entire battle lasted approximately 10 to 15 minutes of actual fighting, though the pursuit of fleeing government soldiers continued for some time afterward. This brevity is itself remarkable and speaks to the totality of the Jacobite victory. Cope's army didn't just lose, it disintegrated. The Highlanders pursued the fleeing government troops with relentless fury. Some soldiers ran toward the sea, others toward Prestonpans village or Edinburgh. Small groups tried to make stands and were quickly overwhelmed. The field was littered with abandoned muskets, backpacks, ammunition, and the dead and wounded. Cope's artillery pieces, which had fired perhaps a dozen shots total, were captured intact along with all his supplies and baggage. The casualty figures tell the story of the battle's one-sidedness. Government losses were catastrophic. Approximately 300 to 500 killed, 400 to 500 wounded, and 1,400 to 1,500 captured. This meant that Cope lost nearly his entire army. Somewhere between 3/4 and 4/5 of his force was killed, wounded, or captured. The Jacobites, by contrast, suffered losses estimated at only 30 to 50 killed and 70 to 80 wounded. These figures represent one of the most lopsided victories in British military history. Sir John Cope himself escaped the battlefield with a small group of cavalry, riding hard for Berwick-upon-Tweed. He had the dubious distinction of being the first British general to bring news of his own defeat to London. Contemporary satirists had a field day with this, and Cope became a figure of ridicule in England, though this was somewhat unfair. He had done his professional best with the forces available, and the true responsibility for the disaster lay in the government's unpreparedness and the complex tactical situation he faced. The Highlanders celebrated their extraordinary victory, capturing enough weapons, ammunition, and supplies to properly equip their army for the first time. They took Cope's artillery pieces, his military chest containing funds for paying the troops, and all his baggage train. More importantly, they had destroyed the only government army in Scotland and secured their hold on Edinburgh. The anatomy of victory. What enabled such a small force to achieve such a crushing victory? The standard narrative emphasizes the Highland charge and the ferocity of the Clansmen, which were certainly important factors. But a deeper analysis reveals multiple elements that combined to produce this result. First, intelligence and reconnaissance proved decisive. Without Robert Anderson's local knowledge of the path through the marsh, the Jacobite army would likely have had to attempt a frontal assault across open ground, which would have been suicidal regardless of Highland courage. This highlights the importance of local knowledge and scouts in pre-modern warfare, advantages that no amount of professional training could provide to outsiders. Second, tactical leadership by Lord George Murray and the other Jacobite commanders deserves recognition. The decision to attempt a night march was bold and risky, but it was also the right decision given the circumstances. Murray understood that conventional tactics would favor Cope's larger, better-equipped army, so he sought unconventional solutions. This flexibility of thinking, the willingness to take calculated risks, is the mark of excellent generalship. Third, the psychology of the situation worked overwhelmingly in the Highlanders' favor. They were attacking at dawn after a successful night march, an achievement that must have bolstered their confidence enormously. They had surprise on their side. They knew exactly what they intended to do and how they planned to do it. Cope's army, by contrast, was scrambled into hasty defensive positions, many of the men frightened and confused. Psychological momentum matters tremendously in battle, and it was entirely with the Jacobites. Fourth, the Highland fighting system was perfectly suited to the tactical situation. The charge worked because Cope's infantry didn't have time to deliver enough volleys to stop it, and his cavalry failed to intervene. In a different scenario, say against veteran troops on favorable ground with more preparation time, the outcome might have been different. But at Prestonpans, every circumstance favored the Highland way of war. Fifth, the relative experience and motivation of the troops mattered. Many of Cope's soldiers were raw recruits or militia with minimal training. The Highlanders, while not professional soldiers in the European sense, were warriors from a martial culture with significant experience in clan warfare and feuding. Moreover, they were fighting for a cause they believed in, led by chiefs they followed willingly. This is not to romanticize the Jacobite cause, which was, after all, an attempt to impose an absolute monarchy on Britain, but simply to note that motivation matters in combat. Finally, there was an element of luck. The night march could have gone wrong in numerous ways. The weather could have been worse. Cope's sentries might have spotted the movement earlier. The government cavalry might have held firm. In war, fortune favors the bold, but sometimes it's simply fortune. The Jacobites got the breaks at Prestonpans, and they exploited them brilliantly. Aftermath and consequences. The immediate aftermath of Prestonpans was euphoric for the Jacobites, but shocking for the British government. Edinburgh Castle, which had held out even as the city fell, now stood isolated. Charles held court at Holyrood Palace, his father's ancestral seat, while his army regrouped and incorporated new recruits inspired by the victory. The young pretender seemed unstoppable. But Prestonpans, for all its drama, proved to be a strategic dead end. Charles's advisers urged him to consolidate control of Scotland and wait for promised French reinforcements that never materialized in sufficient numbers. The prince, however, was determined to march on London. He believed, perhaps correctly, that immediate momentum was crucial and that waiting would allow the government to marshal its forces. The Jacobite army invaded England in November 1745, marching as far south as Derby, just 125 miles from London. This '45 rebellion caused panic in the capital and sent tremors through the British establishment. But without the popular English support Charles had expected, and facing gathering government armies, the Highland chiefs forced him to retreat to Scotland. The terrible defeat at Culloden in April 1746 would end the Jacobite cause forever, with consequences for Highland culture that reverberate to this day. Yet Prestonpans retained its significance in Scottish memory and military history. It demonstrated that unconventional tactics, properly applied, could defeat larger professional armies. It showed the importance of surprise, speed, and psychological shock in battle. These lessons would be studied by military theorists for generations. The battle also became part of Scottish cultural identity, particularly in the Highlands. Songs and poems celebrated the victory. The image of Highland warriors overwhelming British regulars in brutal close-quarters combat became iconic, feeding both Scottish pride and English fear of Celtic warriors. This cultural legacy outlasted the Jacobite cause itself. For the British Army, Prestonpans was a humiliation that demanded explanation and reform. The subsequent campaign against the Jacobites would see brutal reprisals, particularly after Culloden, as the government sought not just military victory, but the destruction of the clan system that had made such fierce warriors possible. The systematic dismantling of Highland culture through laws banning traditional dress, weapons, and the authority of clan chiefs was, in part, a response to the terror inspired by battles like Prestonpans. Legacy. More than 2.5 centuries later, the Battle of Prestonpans remains one of the most dramatic examples of David defeating Goliath in military history. A smaller force, using unconventional tactics and intimate knowledge of local terrain, had destroyed a larger professional army in minutes. The brutality of the Highland charge, the speed of the victory, and the completeness of the rout combined to create a battle that seemed almost mythical in its extremity. The term brutally crushed in describing this battle is not hyperbole, but accurate characterization. Cope's army was effectively annihilated as a fighting force. The survivors were scattered, demoralized, and militarily useless. The psychological impact of such a defeat rippled far beyond the immediate military consequences, affecting British strategic calculations and public morale throughout the rebellion. For students of military history, Prestonpans offers numerous lessons. It demonstrates the value of night operations and surprise attacks. It shows how local knowledge can overcome technological and numerical superiority. It illustrates the importance of troop morale and leadership. And it reveals how tactical systems optimized for conventional warfare can be devastatingly vulnerable to unconventional approaches. The battle also serves as a reminder of the human cost of political conflicts. Hundreds of men died that morning, many of them young soldiers far from home, fighting in a conflict whose causes they may have barely understood. The brutality wasn't abstract or strategic. It was visceral, personal, and final. Standing today on the field where this extraordinary battle occurred, one can still sense the drama of that September morning. The landscape has changed. Urban development has encroached on the battlefield. But the story endures. 4,000 Highland warriors, armed with swords and courage, had met 18,000 government troops, actually closer to 4,000, but the legend grows, and won one of the most complete victories in British history. In just 15 minutes at dawn, they had rewritten the rules of warfare and altered the course of British history, leaving a legacy of fierce Highland pride and military legend that echoes still through the glens and mountains of Scotland.